The mail coach tore through the station fence before Esther Hale could clear the cutting table. One wheel climbed a watering trough. The coach tipped, slammed down, and spilled 2 passengers into the dust. Esther was already running when Harlan Pike threw the broken rein against her apron. "You made this!" Every face in the yard turned toward her. The muddy strap carried her name. If Sweetwater Stage blamed her workmanship, Esther would lose the mail contract, her shop, and the only good name her father had left her. Then she turned the leather over. The letters E. Hale were pressed backward and upside down. "No, someone copied my name and never learned which way a maker holds her stamp." Pike reached for the rein. Caleb Rourke stepped between them. Dust streaked his beard and one sleeve was torn from pulling a passenger clear. He did not touch Esther. He simply raised an open hand and made Pike stop. "That strap stays with her." "You work for this line," Pike warned. "Not if it runs bad gear. No coach leaves until Miss Hale inspects every inch." Pike's fingers closed into a fist. Esther bent the rein. The leather smelled wrong. The stitches leaned the wrong way. Deep inside the torn edge lay a stripe of gray rot. This was not careless workmanship. Someone had built a harness to fail. The station yard had been loud after the crash. Horses squealed, passengers argued, and men dragged the broken fence aside. Yet silence gathered around Esther as she held the torn rein between both hands. She was 34, broad through the waist and hips, with full, strong arms made for pulling a stitching clamp tight. Most people in Red Butte knew those arms could set a copper rivet cleaner than any man within 50 miles. That had never stopped a few of them from deciding that a woman of her size must be slow, clumsy, or grateful for whatever work they allowed her. Pike understood that kind of judgment and used it like a tool. "A backward stamp proves only that you were careless," he said. "The territorial mail agent arrives Saturday. He will see a wrecked coach, injured passengers, and your name on the leather." Saturday was 2 days away. Esther looked toward her shop across the road. Its blue door stood open, and beyond it waited 12 finished bridles, 2 saddle trees, and a note from the bank folded beneath the cash tin. Renewing the Sweetwater contract would pay the building note before winter. Losing it would close the shop her father had built, and she had made profitable. "Then he will also see the truth," she said. Pike smiled without warmth. "If you can find it." He turned to Caleb. "You are suspended. Leave the yard." Caleb wiped the blood from his temple with the back of his hand. "My team stays watered. It is not your team today." The words landed harder than Esther expected. Caleb had driven that chestnut pair over South Pass through sleet and summer dust. Every station hand knew he slept lighter when one of them was lame. Still, he only nodded. "Then see that the left mare gets a cold cloth on her knee." He walked to Esther, stopped at a respectful distance, and looked at the broken rein. "Tell me what you need." "The truth from the wreck site, before wheels and boots grind it away." "Then we had better go now." Pike called after them. "That coach belongs to the line." Esther faced him. "The leather bears my name. Until you clear it or charge me before witnesses, I am keeping the evidence." It was the first boundary she set that day, and Pike's eyes told her it would not be the last. Caleb borrowed a bay gelding from the livery and walked beside Esther's mare along the east road. He did not hurry her with questions. He let her study the rein while the station roofs dropped behind them. "The hide was taken from a sick animal," she finally said. "See the pale channel through the center. Good strap leather bends. This split along old damage." Caleb leaned close enough to see, not close enough to crowd. Could Pike know that? Pike knows invoices and schedules. He may not know leather. But someone working for him might. Esther glanced at him. "You decided quickly." "I decided the moment he tried to take the strap from you." "That is not proof." No. It is why I am helping you find proof. The answer warmed something in her that she had learned to keep guarded. She turned her attention back to the road. They found the first scrape a mile beyond town where the coach had swerved off the packed track. Caleb crouched over the wheel marks. Esther searched the sage until she found a brass buckle half buried in dust. It matched her pattern from a distance. Up close, the tongue was too narrow, and the pin had bent under strain. "Mine are filed from one piece," she said. "This one was poured in a cheap mold." Caleb pointed at two dark marks in the road. "The driver hauled left before the bend, but the team kept right. The rain must have parted here." Esther followed the marks to the ditch. A second strip of leather lay beneath the rabbit brush. It had been sliced halfway through from the flesh side, then rubbed with ash and grease to hide the cut. "The rot made it weak," she said, "but somebody made certain it would break today." Caleb's jaw tightened. There were 6 passengers, and a locked mail chest. He looked toward the distant station. Saturday's coach carries the mine payroll. That was the second question, larger and colder than the first. If the wreck had been meant only to ruin Esther, today would have been enough. If it was a practice run, the next coach would carry $8,000 through the narrow cut east of Red Butte. They rode back with the buckle and cut strap wrapped in Esther's clean saddlecloth. By mid-afternoon, Pike had nailed a notice to her blue door. Sweetwater Stage suspended all purchases from Hale Harness pending the mail agent's inquiry. Beneath the notice, someone had chalked a broad, ugly drawing of a woman whose body filled the doorway. Esther stared at it for one breath. Then she took a wet rag and erased it herself. Caleb waited until the last white streak was gone. "You want me to tear down the notice?" "No. I want every customer to see exactly what Pike is afraid I can prove." She left the paper hanging and opened the shop. Inside, familiar smells steadied her. Oak bark, beeswax, neat's foot oil, iron from the stove. Her workbench held her father's old stamp, the letters cut so they read backward on the steel and straight on leather. She placed the counterfeit beside a genuine rein. The differences multiplied. Her saddle stitches angled like grain in a wheat field. The false stitches marched straight and shallow. Her edges were rounded, then rubbed smooth with wax. The false edge had been painted dark to conceal raw fibers. Caleb watched her hands, not her body, not the notice on the door. "You see a whole language in it," he said. "Leather tells the truth after people are done talking." "Then teach me enough to listen." She showed him how to flex a strap and feel the fibers shift. His hands were large, scarred across the knuckles, but careful. When he found the hidden cut, without her pointing, his eyes lifted to hers. For a moment, the shop seemed smaller. "Good," she said. His mouth tipped at one corner. "High praise from Esther Hale. Do not grow proud. You still pull a stitch like a man hauling fence wire." He laughed once, low and surprised. The sound loosened the knot beneath her ribs. Then Caleb noticed a dark smear along the false strap. "What is that?" Esther rubbed it between finger and thumb. Pine tar, but mixed with something sharp and mineral. She crossed to a shelf and lifted 3 scraps from recent repairs. Each came from a Sweetwater harness. Each carried the same gray-black dressing. "These were brought in over the last month," she said. "Cracked keepers, torn billets, a trace that stretched in rain. I thought Pike had delayed replacing old gear." "He was replacing it," Caleb said. "Just not with yours." The midpoint of the mystery began there, in a row of scraps on a clean pine table. The first wreck had not introduced the counterfeit harness. It had exposed a quiet replacement scheme already spreading through every Sweetwater station. Caleb remembered seeing unmarked gear arrive in freight crates after midnight. Pike had called it emergency stock from Cheyenne. Esther remembered Pike offering to buy her shop 6 weeks earlier, saying a woman alone should be relieved of heavy work. She had refused. If her contract failed after a public accident, Pike could install his own supplier, buy her tools at auction, and present himself to the mail agent as the man who saved the route. But greed alone did not explain the cut strap or the coming payroll. They needed corroboration. Esther went to the stable office at sunset with Caleb beside her. Noah Tebb, Pike's night foreman, stood in the doorway. He was a narrow man with chapped hands and eyes that moved too often toward the yard. "I need the receiving book for harness shipments," Esther said. "Company property." "So was the coach that nearly killed 6 people," Noah swallowed. "Mr. Pike says you are barred." Caleb shifted his weight, but Esther lifted one finger without looking at him. This was her question to ask. "Did you replace the West coach's reins last night?" Noah's face answered before his mouth did. "I oil what I am told to oil. That was not my question." Pike's voice came from behind them. "And he does not owe you an answer." He carried a new harness over one arm. Its leather gleamed black and smooth enough to impress anyone who did not know what lay beneath the surface. "Saturday's coach will run with safe equipment," he announced. "Equipment supplied by Pike Freight and guaranteed by me." Esther took one step closer. "Let me cut a cross-section from the end." His smile vanished. "You will not touch it." "Then your guarantee is worth less than the paint on that edge." 2 station hands pretended not to listen. A woman collecting a parcel stopped beside the platform. Pike saw the witnesses and changed his tone. "Miss Hale is distressed. Caleb, take her home." "She decides where she goes," Caleb said. Pike's eyes hardened. "There will be no work for you on any line I control." Caleb removed the Sweetwater badge from his coat. He placed it on the receiving desk between them. "Then you had better learn to drive your own team." The price of his choice sat in that small brass badge. Esther knew he had a widowed sister in Laramie who depended on part of his wages. She knew a driver without a route could spend months waiting for another opening. Pike knew it too. For the first time, his public mask slipped. "Both of you will be gone by Sunday." Esther looked at the new harness. "Maybe. But that gear will speak before we do." That night, she did not sleep. She tested every counterfeit scrap with water, heat from a low iron, and pressure from her stitching jack. The gray dressing softened and released its odor. Beneath it, the cheap leather showed scars and flaking fibers. Caleb returned after midnight with coffee and a folded telegram blank. "The mail agent is already on the westbound train," he said. "Pike moved the inspection to sunrise Saturday. He means to run the payroll coach immediately afterward." They had 1 day, not 2. Esther stared at the scraps until their pattern became a plan. "If Pike believes I can identify every false strap, he will remove the worst ones before the inspection. And hide them. Or destroy them." "What do you want him to think?" She looked at her father's stamp, then at a coil of new russet leather on the wall. "I want him to think I built the only harness that can save his route." By dawn, Esther had made a new set of reins and traces. She worked with the shop doors open so every passerby could see. She chose deep chestnut leather, strong enough for a freight team, and stitched a narrow blue thread beneath each folded keeper, where it could not be seen unless the strap was opened. She stamped her name in the usual place. On the inner face of the right trace, she pressed a tiny half-moon with a cobbler's awl. It was not evidence by itself. It was a way to know her work if someone stole it. Caleb shaped buckles at the forge under her direction. He ruined the first pin, swore at the second, and made the third serviceable. "You learn," she told him, "slowly." "Slow is better than proud." "That may be the nicest thing you have said to me." Their eyes met over the workbench. Esther felt the awareness between them, quiet and adult, asking nothing she was not ready to give. She broke it first. Take the finished harness to the station at noon. Tell Pike I will certify it only if he lets me inspect every other set in front of the mail agent. He will say no, at first. And after that, he will arrange for mine to disappear. Caleb studied her face. You are using your best work as bait. I am using what he thinks I value most. What do you value most? Esther looked around the shop, at her father's tools, the banknote, the blue door scarred by 20 winters. The right to put my name on honest work. Caleb nodded as if she had entrusted him with something precious. Then I will bring it back. At noon, Pike accepted the harness in front of 3 witnesses. He agreed to Esther's condition because refusing would look like fear. Noah carried the set into the locked tack room. Pike kept the key. Esther spent the afternoon repairing the injured coach driver's old saddle at no charge. It cost her half a hide she could not afford to spare, but his testimony mattered less to her than the truth that he had been hurt using gear marked with her name. Near dusk, he came to the shop. Pike told me to say the rein felt soft when I harnessed up, he admitted. It did not. I never touched those reins until after the crash. Noah hitched the team before sunrise. Will you say that tomorrow? Fear moved across his face. I have a wife. So did 2 of the men Pike nearly killed. He looked down at the saddle she had repaired. I will tell what I saw, nothing more. The truth needs nothing more. After dark, Caleb watched the tack room alley from the loft of the closed feed store. Esther waited inside her shop with the lamp turned low. Her plan required patience, and patience was harder than labor. An hour before midnight, a shadow crossed the road. Noah Tebb unlocked the tack room and carried Esther's harness to a Pike freight wagon. He returned with a black set over his shoulder, the same shiny gear Pike had displayed. Caleb could have seized him. Esther had ordered him not to. Noah loaded her harness beneath a canvas and drove east. Caleb followed at a distance. Esther rode by a second path to the abandoned lime shed beyond Miller's Cut, where Pike Freight stored damaged crates. Through a broken board, she saw Noah lay her harness beside stacks of counterfeit gear. Harlan Pike stepped from the darkness. Burn all of it before dawn, he said. Hale's set too. Noah hesitated. That good harness is worth $80. Her name is what we are burning. Esther's breath stopped. Pike struck a match. Caleb moved, but Esther was faster. She shoved open the shed door and kicked the bucket of lamp oil away before Pike could drop the flame. You should have taken my offer, he snarled. You should have learned which way to hold a stamp. Pike threw the match. It caught dry canvas instead of oil. Fire climbed the wagon side. Noah bolted. Caleb dragged 2 crates clear while Esther pulled her russet harness from beneath the canvas. A burning bean dropped between them. Heat drove her back. Leave it! Caleb shouted. The harness was proof, but the racks behind it held more. False Hale straps, cheap buckles, and a small steel punch with her name cut the wrong way. Esther wrapped her apron around one hand, reached through smoke, and seized the punch. Caleb caught her around the shoulders only when the roof beam cracked. He pulled her through the doorway as the center of the shed collapsed. They hit the dirt together. Esther coughed until her ribs hurt. Caleb released her at once and rolled onto one knee. Tell me you did not go back for a piece of steel. She opened her burned apron. The counterfeit stamp lay in her palm. I went back for my name. For one heartbeat, anger and relief fought across his face. Then he sat in the dust and laughed softly, not because anything was funny, but because she was alive. Pike escaped on Noah's horse. The fire took half the shed before men from town formed a bucket line. Enough counterfeit gear survived to show a pattern, but Pike would claim it had been planted. The stamp could be called a blacksmith's prank. They still needed to connect his scheme to the public inspection and the payroll coach. Worse, during the fire, someone had cut the telegraph line east of town. Pike's no-return choice was clear. He meant to send the payroll coach through Miller's Cut before warning could leave Red Butte. A weakened harness could stop the coach exactly where armed men waited. At first light, the station yard filled with townspeople. News of the fire had traveled faster than sleep. The territorial mail agent, Mr. Bellows, arrived from the rail stop in a dust-colored coat. Pike stood beside the payroll coach, calm once more, with 2 armed guards in the shiny black harness on the team. He had returned before dawn and shaped the story in his favor. Esther, he said, had broken into his warehouse, burned company property, and planted a false stamp to avoid responsibility for the first wreck. The sheriff was away serving papers at a ranch. His deputy, uncertain and young, asked everyone to remain peaceful. Bellows examined the black harness. "This is the gear you guarantee for today's run?" "Made from first-quality hide," Pike said. Esther stepped through the crowd in a deep blue wool dress beneath her leather apron. Soot marked one cheek. Her right palm was bandaged, but she carried herself upright. Caleb walked beside her, wearing no Sweetwater badge. Pike pointed. "Arrest them." The deputy looked at Esther. "Do you have evidence that belongs in this inquiry?" She held up the backward-cut stamp. "I have the tool used to counterfeit my mark. I have burned gear carrying the same false impression, and I can prove the harness on that team was placed there after midnight." Pike reached for the reins. "We are already late." Caleb stepped between him and the team, open hand raised, the same quiet block he had made after the crash. "No coach leaves until she finishes." Pike swung at him. Caleb took the blow and did not return it. 2 station hands pulled Pike back. The crowd had now seen what fear looked like beneath his clean vest. Esther approached the right trace. "This is the harness Pike displayed Thursday," she said. "The one he claimed was safe. Cut the folded keeper open." Bellows gave the deputy a nod. The deputy used his pocket knife. No blue thread lay beneath the fold. No half moon marked the inner face. This was not Esther's bait harness. Pike smiled. "You have proved only that I refused your work." "No. I proved you switched it. Now open your freight wagon." The wagon stood behind the station office. Pike's confidence faltered. The deputy lifted the canvas. Esther's russet harness lay beneath 2 empty rifle cases. The blue thread remained under each keeper, and the half moon sat exactly where she had placed it. Beside it rested a coil of cut telegraph wire and 3 cheap buckles from the same flawed mold as the one found at the wreck. A murmur moved through the yard, but Esther was not finished. She turned to Noah Tebb, who stood near the stable with ash on his boots. "You hitched the false reins before the first wreck. You switched the harness last night, and you drove my set to the lime shed. Pike will say every choice was yours." Noah looked at Pike. Pike's face told him she was right. Esther lowered her voice, though the yard remained silent enough to hear. "Tell the truth before another driver enters Miller's Cut." Noah's mouth worked once before sound came. "Pike said the first coach would only lose a wheel. Said nobody would be hurt. He wanted Hale blamed so his company could take the mail gear contract." Bellows asked, "And today's coach?" Noah stared at the rifle cases. 2 men are waiting in the cut. Pike promised them the payroll. He weakened the left lead trace himself." Esther crossed to the team and flexed that trace. The painted edge cracked. Inside, a narrow cut waited to open under the first hard pull. She held it up so the driver, the deputy, the mail agent, and every witness could see. "This is what really happened. My name was used to make rotten work look honest. Then honest work was hidden so rotten men could look respectable." No one laughed at her body. No one looked at the chalk stain still faintly visible on her blue door. They looked at her hands and the failed strap those hands had exposed. Pike tried to run. Caleb did not chase him. The deputy and 2 guards brought him down before he reached the alley. Caleb stayed beside Esther and the frightened team, exactly where she needed him. The payroll coach did not enter Miller's Cut. A mounted party went ahead and found 2 armed men near a felled tree. Bellows postponed the route until every harness set could be inspected. He did not hand Esther a miracle or declare her rich. He did something more useful. He ordered the counterfeit gear removed, recorded testimony from the driver and station hands, and required Sweetwater's local owners to pay Esther for the damaged stock that bore her name. Future equipment would be accepted only after an independent maker's inspection entered in the receiving book. Pike and Noah faced a territorial inquiry. Noah's cooperation would matter. So would the fact that he had chosen to endanger passengers. Consequences would come by process, not by a cheering crowd's hunger. Esther's contract was restored for 6 months, with a review after winter. It was enough to pay the banknote, not enough to let her grow careless. 3 days later, she replaced the chalk-scarred blue door with one Caleb had planed from cottonwood. He had found temporary work hauling ore for a line Pike did not control. Before he left for his first run, he brought the repaired Sweetwater badge into her shop. "Bellows offered me my route back," he said. Esther set down her awl. "Will you take it?" "After the new owners agree that a driver may refuse unsafe gear without losing his wages." She smiled. "Slow is better than proud." I had a hard teacher. He placed something else on the bench. The broken counterfeit rein from the crash, cleaned of mud but not repaired. "Thought you might want to burn it." Esther turned the backward mark toward the light. "No, I am going to hang it above the door." "Why keep a lie?" "Because it failed." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "Esther, I stood beside you because I believed you. Somewhere along the road, believing you became the easiest part." She felt no rush of rescue in his words, no claim laid over her future, only an honest man making an honest offer. "What is the difficult part?" "Leaving town when every road out of it leads away from you." She let the quiet sit between them. Love, if that was what this might become, would not be payment for his help. It would not own her shop or choose her work. It had to arrive freely, with room for her answer. Esther walked around the bench and took his rough hand in hers. "Then stop looking for a road out." Caleb exhaled. He bent his head, giving her time to turn away. She did not. Their first kiss was gentle, brief, and warm with promise rather than possession. By the first snow, the shop carried a new sign, "Hale Harness and Inspection." Beneath it hung the false rein, its upside-down mark visible to anyone who asked. Caleb returned to the mail route under the new safety rule. He still brought every fresh set of gear through Esther's blue door before a long run. Sometimes he claimed he needed an inspection when he only wanted coffee and 10 quiet minutes at her workbench. She always charged him the proper fee. And when he complained, she reminded him that good work cost more because it carried an honest name.